Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Will Lowen, and I'm the pastor here at Trinity Mennonite Church, just south of Calgary, Alberta. This is the sermon video for April the 26th, 2020. This is the second Sunday after Easter. And at this point, even if only symbolically, we are supposed to have allowed the resurrection story to take root in our lives. We're supposed to be living into the hope and the joy that it gives us. So is that your experience? Well, if not, you're certainly not the only one. A lot of people are feeling the weight of what is happening around us, and it is interfering with our ability to live into that joy and hope. But I believe that the Bible offers us reassurance, especially in today's story, that in our dark and difficult times, the resurrected Jesus steps in, and in our encounter of him, we are reassured and we are given new joy and new hope. The story is of two disciples encountering Jesus on their way to the village of Emmaus. It comes to us from the Gospel of Luke. So let's turn there together. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35, from the Common English Bible. On that same day, two disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, and their faces were downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place there over the last few days?" He said to them, "What things?" They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago. But there's more. Some women from our group have left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who told him he was still alive." Some of those who were with him went to the tomb and found the things just as the women said. They didn't see him. Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road, and when he explained the scriptures for us?" They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord really has risen. He appeared to Simon." Then the two disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. One of the things that struck me as interesting as I was reading the story this week was it felt a little bit like maybe it doesn't belong in the Gospel of Luke. Now, for a lot of us, the 4 Gospels are almost interchangeable. They tell more or less the same stories. But a close look shows that they do it in a different way. Each of them offers their own portrait of who Jesus was and what his emphases were. The Gospel of Mark seems to have been written earlier. It's very concise, and there are a lot of aspects of this story, although it's long, and it takes 3 minutes to read it. There are a lot of stories that are pieces of the story that are left out. And so you could say maybe it belongs in Mark. Mark seems to have been written by someone for whom Greek was a second language. The level of complexity of the Greek isn't very good. So it seems like it paints a more simplistic picture of who Jesus was. Well, Matthew, the emphasis seems very much to say who Jesus was in relation to Hebrew prophecy, Old Testament prophecy. And so then we could say, well, it seems to fit in there because in the story, Jesus unpacks for the disciples who he was in relation to the Hebrew scriptures. And not just in relation to, but that all of the Hebrew scriptures pointed to Jesus. And so in that sense, it very much would belong there. It would fit in the Gospel of Matthew. John doesn't really seem to fit the other three. The other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are synoptic Gospels. John seems to have been written later, much more poetic, much more reliant on imagery and symbolism. And so within this story, it's such a metaphor for our lives that it seems like maybe this metaphorical story, although I believe it happened, belongs in John with all of the other beautiful metaphors. And yet we find it instead in Luke. Luke, as we understand it, was written by a doctor. This was a companion of Paul who traveled with him and on different missionary journeys. And he begins his gospel, the Gospel of Luke. In an introduction, he says, "I have set out to write for you, dear Theophilus." So which could either be a person, maybe a wealthy patron who's paying for the work to be written, or it could be a nickname. The roots of the word would just mean lover of God, which could be any of us. "I have set out to write for you, dear Theophilus, a detailed account of what has happened." And this is what we need doctors for. Every day we have doctors on TV giving us detailed accounts of what's happening with this pandemic. Some of the most difficult conversations of our lives happen with doctors giving us a detailed account. You know, in our English language, we have a slang for the skills that a doctor needs to communicate detailed accounts in personable ways, right? We would say that if a doctor doesn't have a good bedside manner, then they're not very good at going beyond the detailed accounts. Well, in this story, the detailed account would be nice, but it's sort of missing. The detailed account tells us what happened. It leaves out the names. We know one of them is Cleopas. Who's the other one? There's none of the 12 disciples was named Cleopas. And so where does this disciple come from? Are they a Galilean disciple? Is it someone who's joined the movement later on, more recently? They seem to have a familiarity with Jerusalem, and so there might be a connection there. But we don't know. The detailed account has left that out. And while we would want to get to that information, there are other aspects of the story that, boy, we would love to have. Jesus is walking with the disciples and tells them all of the ways that the Old Testament scriptures point to him. And the detailed account tells us that happened, but it doesn't tell us what the things were that Jesus said. And that would sure be interesting. You know, Jesus could have said, well, you know how Moses was rescued as a child. He had to be sent out to protect him from an evil government who was killing children. He could have talked about how Moses would grow up and lead the people out of slavery into freedom, into a promised land. Jesus could both have said, well, that's exactly what I've come to do. That's exactly what happened to me. And he could have gone on and done similar things with the stories of David and Solomon and all of the prophets, major and minor prophets. That would have been a fascinating Bible study for us in our contemporary time. The detailed account leaves that out. This is one of two very important conversion stories in the Bible. One is the story of Paul. On his way to Damascus, he encounters Jesus. There's a light from heaven. He's knocked off of his horse. He's made blind, and he hears the voice of Jesus. Powerful story. And in that moment, Paul is instantaneously changed. His life will never be the same, and he has no questions because it's clearly Jesus. What's going to happen next? Well, yeah, that's a fair question, but what's happening, that was obvious. In this story, it's much more gradual. There is an encounter of Jesus, but it's much more confusing. The revelation is much slower until finally everything has happened. Jesus breaks the bread with his followers, and then he begins to see. It's such a beautiful story, a beautiful metaphor for ourselves. That here are these disciples. They begin in Jerusalem, in the high point, geographically, topographically. They begin in Jerusalem, and then from there, from the high point, they descend into the valley. But emotionally, it's the other way around. Emotionally, they begin in a dark place. They have dark and difficult emotions. The grief and the sadness, of course, of losing a good friend and a teacher, but also confusion and fear. And so here they have these dark emotions, and they're walking from Jerusalem, from the mountain city, and they're walking down and away from it. And in their darkness, Jesus comes to them. Jesus comes to walk with them. Now, it says in the story that they were prevented from seeing him. Now, maybe there's a connection there with a sort of a light imagery, that here they are, the mountaintop experience. They're close to the sun. They're close to heaven as far as they understand. And yet, there's a darkness. There's a darkness of their emotions. There's a darkness in what they are able to see. They can't understand what has happened. And so, they are prevented from seeing Jesus, and yet they talk together. Jesus comes to be with them in the darkness of their journey, in the darkness of their feelings. And they walk with Jesus. They share their concerns, their frustrations. And Jesus does a strange thing. We would expect him to be compassionate and listen, but Jesus speaks harshly to them. He calls them dull. Other translations might use something more colorful or maybe gentler, but this is not a pleasant exchange. Jesus says that they are dull because they don't understand. So more of this light idea. Not a lot of light is getting in. They are hard of heart and they are not able to see. So they walk. Jesus explains to them. And they say later on, weren't our hearts on fire? And so they're listening. And they're really getting into what he's saying. So much so that when they reach the point, it's not a very long walk, but it is a few hours. They're walking together, and they get to the point where they're going to stop. It's home or wherever. They get there, they're going to spend the night, they're going to eat, and they want this stranger, they want the man who's appeared to them to sit with them, eat with them, talk with them, probably spend the night because it's about nighttime. So Jesus agrees. He enters the home with them. They eat together, and when Jesus breaks the bread, then their eyes are opened and they see. And so when we imagine the surface details of this event, they're carrying a big load from Jerusalem, right? They're carrying the negative emotions that I was talking about before. and they're ready to end the day. They're also exhausted from this walk. They're exhausted from the events of the week. And then in the moment, Jesus reveals who he is, and all of that is gone. All of the negative emotions, gone. All of the fatigue and lack of energy and all of the sadness, all of that is gone. Because as soon as that happens, they're not able to stay where they are anymore. They can't stay in the valley. They have to go back up to the mountain. Luke gives us a detailed account. And in these details, we miss out on some of the things we would like to hear. But we get this emotional journey. That emotional journey is familiar to us. So, yeah, we are in a difficult spot. And all of the difficult and negative emotions that we're feeling now, all of them are relevant. All of them bring us down, and they should. The fear of illness, the grief of loved ones who are sick or approaching death or have died, the loss of income security, the loss of meaningful employment, all of those things. It is right and good to grieve those things when they pass us. So then in that moment, we are walking into the valley. Now, what has changed in the real world for these people? Well, nothing. Their movement is still illegal outside of orthodoxy. There are still only a few of them. A lot of it has not changed, but their capacity to see beyond that has. Some of us are doing well. Some of us have the internal fortitude, God-given grace to look at these problems and smile and help others to smile. Some of us weren't doing that well ahead of time. And so we've had a difficult time adjusting to the new difficulties because we haven't adjusted to the old difficulties. So no matter where you are on the emotional journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus and back up to Jerusalem, Jesus is walking with you, whether you recognize it or not. And so we need to open our ears and free ourselves to encounter Jesus. But there's something else in the story that's fascinating. I feel like the disciples here were more free to complain, more free to share their frustrations than if they had stayed in Jerusalem. You know, to be among the other disciples, there were probably things they weren't supposed to say. They'd heard that the tomb was empty. It seems like they didn't really believe it, and if they did believe it, they didn't know what to do with it. And so within that circle, maybe they weren't allowed to talk about how sad they were. Maybe they weren't allowed to share their frustrations, but on the walk, they could. And so this stranger was able to hear the honest expression. The stranger didn't need them to say that they were blindly optimistic. The stranger didn't need them to quote the scriptures back to him. The stranger, who was Jesus, listened to their concerns and explained to them what was happening. And it wasn't a gentle process, and oftentimes for us to be corrected isn't gentle either. But Jesus walks with us. Jesus walks with us in our difficulties and in our excitement. Another one of the details, of course, that's missing is why. Jesus didn't need to walk with them. Why did he choose to walk with these two? Why did he choose to appear in this way at this time? So many details are missing. But those details in Luke's detailed account aren't the important part. The disciples are going on an emotional journey. We get to go on that emotional journey too, even when we don't want to. So look into this story. Find yourself there, and you will find Jesus walking with you. So allow yourself to speak freely. Allow yourself to feel your heart burning. and allow Jesus to speak hope and guidance to you. Amen.